Okay, as promised, this will be a nice short one. We want to talk a little bit about sociological paradigms. A paradigm is a theoretical perspective, really, really broad scale theoretical perspective or worldview. Yeah. Um, the Maybe the analogy would be to a school of thought, right? Like a school of thought is probably another way to think about paradigms. In sociology, there are three major theoretical paradigms. The paradigms are structural functionalism, critical conflict theory, and what we call symbolic interaction. Now, the structural functionalism paradigm emerges out of the work of Neil Durkheim. Critical conflict theory emerges out of the work of mostly people like Karl Marx, but also to a certain extent people like Max Weber. Symbolic interactionism is actually a paradigm that emerges in the United States. It's what we call a micro level paradigm, which means it's focused on what's happening in small groups and in small interactions. What we would call social psychology. That's driven. Social psychology is primarily driven by a kind of interactionist framework. So it's kind of uniquely American, and it's pretty different from both the functionalist and the critical conflict paradigm. The thing that differentiates paradigms from one another isn't just their level of analysis, right? So you got micro level paradigm in the form of symbolic interaction. You've got macro level paradigms in the form of functionalism and critical conflict theory, but also in the underlying assumptions. The underlying assumption in functionalism is that social structures exist because they produce socially beneficial outcomes. They produce functions. Remember, we talked about those a while back. We talked about functions being either manifest or latent, but whether they are manifest or latent, they are socially beneficial. So structures exist because they are functional. If they didn't serve a function, then they wouldn't exist. Now, one of the problems with that paradigm is it seems to suggest that even something that seems to be socially problematic, like, for example, crime, must be serving some kind of function because crime is something that persists. If it didn't provide some kind of socially beneficial outcome, why would it continue to exist, right? So there's a kind of justification for the status quo that's part of structural functionalism that I think is part of the reason why this is not a particularly vibrant um, paradigm in the 21st century. I think structural functionalism was a really dominant paradigm in American sociology from the early 1900s until about the 1950s, maybe even into the early 1960s. But since then, it's definitely been on a kind of downward trajectory, in part, again, because it seems to be a defense of the status quo, but also because there isn't really much of a mechanism for change, right? If structures exist because they're functional, um, then why do those structures change? Why do those structures get altered over time? If everything is functional as it's structured, there'd be no reason for it to change. Whereas conflict theory, the underlying assumption there being that conflict is the thing that's driving um, social organization and social order because the people who have resources or power or wealth or whatever are going to do things designed to sort of protect and maintain their position of dominance, whereas groups who don't have those things are going to try very much to change circumstances so that they can get them, and it's going to be an exercise in the leverage of power and persuasion and sometimes violent conflict. So you've got a fundamentally and very, very different sort of paradigm characterized by really, really different underlying assumptions. So, um, so those are the dominant paradigms. There are probably still functionalists out there in the world of sociology, but I would say in the 21st century, the two dominant theoretical paradigms in the discipline are going to be either conflict theory or interactionism. And sometimes you'll find some space where both where both conflict theory and interactionism can kind of overlap, or at least on some conceptual levels coexist. I told you this one was going to be short, and I'm not lying. That's it. This is a very basic, straightforward unit. I will say one quick thing about these paradigms. Most sociologists in the United States, with the exception of interactionists, I would say most sociologists in the United States, when they generate theory, when they sort of carve out a niche in terms of an area that they're interested in studying or focusing on, very often don't pay much attention to these big, large paradigms. They tend to be a little bit more narrowly focused on just the area in which their theory fits. So some people do, say, organizational theory. Some people do social network theory. Some people do deviance, right? So their territory, if you will, their intellectual and scholarly territory is a little bit narrowly and tightly defined. You can see, when you know what to look for, you can see whether they are coming at these topics and these areas of focus from a functionalist perspective, an interactionist perspective, or a conflict perspective. But very often people will not sort of signal their allegiance or signal their team membership all that aggressively, so much as focusing just on their narrow area of theory and research. So, all right, I guess until next time, take care.